Well, good evening, friends. My name is Cameron Patterson. I am the executive director here at the Robert Russell Moton Museum, a civil rights national historic landmark affiliated with Longwood University. And I'm excited to welcome you to the virtual presentation of the Dr. C.G. Gordon Moss Lecture, featuring Dr. Dwana Waugh, Assistant Professor of History at Sweetbriar College. The Dr. C.G. Gordon Moss Lecture is a joint collaborative effort with the Longwood University Department of History, Political Science, and Philosophy, the Longwood University Greenwood Library, and the Longwood University Office of Academic Affairs. We are grateful to those who have helped to financially support the Moss Lecture. Particularly, we are grateful to Ms. Sharon Coulter Gibbs for her continued support. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Larissa Smith, Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Longwood University, who will share some reflections about the life and legacy of Dr. C.G. Gordon Moss and the establishment of the Moss Lecture.
Good evening, everyone. I wish we could all be together in person. But here we are together online, and I just want to let everyone know that we miss our in-person events at Moton and at Longwood, and we're looking forward to bringing them back in the fall. If you are familiar with Longwood's campus, Dr. C.G. Gordon Moss's name might ring a bell. We have named one of our newly renovated residence halls for him. It is a renaissance of a residence hall. Or you might have encountered Dr. Moss in the history exhibition in Radcliffe Hall, which is our new admissions building on High Street. If you have taken a history course at Longwood, you have passed his portrait that hangs in the history department on the second floor of the rotunda. That portrait was recently featured in a Greenwood Library program on Longwood Historic Portraits, which is available on YouTube. So check it out. Some of you in the audience tonight may yourself remember Dr. Gordon Moss from the school closings era or from his later work in the late 1960s and into the 1970s with the local Human Relations Council. I will confess that I'm envious that you had had a chance to meet him and get to know him. Dr. Gordon Moss served as a professor of history at Longwood College from 1944 to 1969. And from 1960 to 1964, he served as dean of the faculty, which at the time was the chief academic officer. So I've always admired Dr. Moss personally. I serve in the position that he served in the 1960s, and like him too, I'm a professor of American history. Dr. Moss was born in Lynchburg in 1899. He served as a corporal in World War I in 1918. In 1921, he graduated from Washington and Lee University with a degree in history and went on to earn his PhD in history from Yale University in 1929. During the 1920s, he also taught at Longwood, which was then called the State Teachers College. But he really made his career here in the 1950s and 1960s. The school closings here in Prince Edward, which lasted from 1959 to 1964, was a transformative period for Dr. Moss. During that time, he became an outspoken advocate of reopening the schools, and he was one of the only white people in the community to do so. His faith as a member of the Episcopal Church and his training as a historian compelled him to speak out and work for equality and justice for all Americans. In the summer of 1963, Dr. Moss was visited by Neil Sullivan, who would become the superintendent of the Prince Edward Free Schools that fall. Sullivan described Moss as a, quote, mild, quiet-spoken man who had suffered personal abuse and ostracism for his support of public integrated schools. Dr. Moss told Sullivan at the time, "I've been teaching American history for 40 years. I've been teaching that democracy and social justice are the greatest ideals of the American nation. I'd be a traitor to the thousands of students I've taught if I didn't take a stand for these ideals when the opportunity comes. That observation by Dr. Moss inspired this lecture series, which features historians who study individuals like Dr. Moss, individuals who have struggled and fought in America for democracy, equality, and social justice. This observation also inspires us at Longwood as we teach our students and prepare them to be citizen leaders who will make a positive contribution to the common good. So if there are students in the audience, I hope you listen carefully to the individuals you'll encounter tonight in Dr. Waugh's lecture. I'd now like to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Brent Roberts, Dean of our Greenwood Library, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see you out there. I'm sure you're out there. I can't actually see you. Greenwood Library, we at Greenwood Library are very excited to support this lecture series honoring the life and legacy of Dr. Gordon Moss, and especially excited this evening to introduce our wonderful speaker, Dr. Dwana Waugh. Dr. Waugh is an assistant professor of history at Sweetbriar College. She received her bachelor's degree in history and education at Randolph-Macon Women's College and earned her master's and PhD in American history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research specializes in African American educational history with a focus on public and oral histories, including research that she has done at Longwood University's very own Greenwood Library Special Collections and Archives. She examines the connections between race, politics, and historical memory in Southern education. As a former public high school teacher, she is committed to exploring these connections between the contemporary past with recent educational policies. Dr. Waugh teaches courses in U.S. history, African American history, historical memory, and educational methodology. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dwana Waugh.
Hi, thank you for such a warm welcome. These kinds of meetings are awkward and certainly have been a lot more prolific in this time period for this season. I want to give thanks to Longwood for inviting me to give this lecture, to Dr. Smith, to Dr. Roberts, and to Mr. Patterson for inviting me to talk about student activism in Moton High School and the memory of Moton High School. So I am going to share my screen, which hopefully everyone can see. Oops. So today, this evening, I want to talk about fighting back, forging ahead, how race and power shape the collective memory of Black student protests in Prince Edward County. And I'm reminded that a little over a month from today, 70 years ago, a group of students led by Barbara Johns went on strike for greater resources and a greater presence and greater justice for African American students in Prince Edward County. So anniversaries have their weight. They're useful reminders of the things that we value both individually and collectively. So in the summer of 1994, Prince Edward County stood on the brink of yet another racial controversy. Former all-Black Robert Russell Moton High School was threatened to be torn down by county officials. Now, 30 years earlier, the all-white leadership had decided to close the high school, which was a site of student-led protests that sparked the test case for the Brown decision, along with the rest of the public school system. They worked to prevent the desegregation of public schools, effectively preventing the county's Black residents from receiving a free and public education for 5 years. Now, many of the same whites who sought the demolition of R.R. Moton High School, such as County Board of Supervisors member Hugh Carwile, argued that, quote, "We don't want this to become a race problem. The county may be better served if the building is removed because it's like a constant reminder, like rubbing salt in a wound." Yet many African Americans turned the preservation of Moton into a rallying cry for crafting a new narrative of empowerment. Petitioning the local press and seeking federal status as a national monument, former Black high school teacher Vera Allen mounted a grassroots campaign to retain the building as a critical part of Prince Edward's history. Allen argued that commemorating R.R. Moton High was a battle for our last legacy. And this battle over the public memory of the formerly all-Black high school in Prince Edward County reveals the racial legacy of the county's school desegregation history. Now, I became interested in examining Prince Edward County as a graduate student, and I was looking for a comparison between another school, an all-Black high school that I was examining in North Carolina, in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And I recalled some stories that I remember from childhood about Farmville and its desegregation, and became more aware of this strike in 1951. And through my research, I have uncovered another strike in 1969. And I thought it's a useful comparison for us to understand what are the things that we remember and the things that we forget. So some of the questions that I ask is, how do we and should we remember this 1951 student strike that led to the Brown versus Board of Education court case? Why don't we remember the 1969 student strike in a more collective way? What do we and can we understand about collective memory when we reflect on student activism in Prince Edward County? Why is R.R. Moton so significant? As Ms. Allen said, it's a battle for our last legacy. What does that mean? Do we remember the closings, the lost generation, or do we craft a new narrative or a counter narrative of the resilience in the push to develop R.R. Moton into what is now Moton Museum? Charles Payne, a noted historian, an educational scholar, in a 2004 journal article for the Journal of American History, the piece was titled "The Whole U.S. is Southern, Brown versus Board of Education and the Mystification of Race," reflecting on yet another anniversary, the 50th anniversary of Brown v. Board. He argued that Brown is becoming a milestone in search of something to signify. I had the good fortune of having Dr. Payne as a professor, and I remember him talking about the Brown case and the importance of the Brown case and what it means and meant to community members. And what he argues in this piece was that Brown was and is symbolic. But in his search for something to signify, there's a tendency to see Brown, to see race in ways that are not structural, that there are, we miss seeing the systemic role of race in the development of our nation and in the development of how our educational systems grow and thrive. Black and white students' placement within the same school building ostensibly signaled racial improvement. This integration process, ostensibly with Brown, is a progress narrative. This notion of integration success cultivated this ideology of Brown as anti-racist. Though, as Payne asserts, it perpetuates this view of race in ways that we don't really get to the institutional nature of racism in our institutions and the fabric of our society. That is, that the myth of Brown ignores these narratives of systemic racism in favor of more progressive stories. And it is here that I argue that the contested memory of R.R. Moten in Prince Edward County is intersecting with this myth, this mythology that has developed around Brown. Brown represented two student-led protests, one in 1951 and the other in 1969. The former, the 1951 student strike, has been remembered in positive and progressive terms, while the latter, the 1969 strike, has largely been forgotten. The 1951 strike emerged as the center of youth-initiated protests and is a significant part of the larger civil rights movement. However, the 1969 protest at Moten against inadequate resources and uneven racial power dynamics has been largely ignored. And I argue that it's by understanding this legacy of these two student protests surrounding Moten High that we can see the ways in which race and power intersect to inform the making of a community's memory. So, as many of you may know, R.R. Moten High was constructed in 1939. It had 6 classrooms and a central auditorium, and the school was built to handle just 180 students. But rapidly, the school exceeded its capacity. And by 1945, student enrollment almost triples, where it peaks at 450 students, bursting at the seams. And to address the overpopulation of the high school, the county school board erected temporary tar paper buildings as answers to the space problem. And it was one morning when Barbara Johns, pictured in the top right corner, is waiting for the school bus and misses the school bus, which had a tendency of breaking down frequently. And she witnessed a school bus carrying white school children that seemed to have fewer problems and seemed to be better put together. She vowed then and there that she would help to develop an organized protest along with other student leaders at Moten High to protest to the county the inequitable resources that existed. She met the next morning with student leaders like John Stokes, who's pictured in the bottom left, his twin sister, Carrie Stokes, Edwilda Allen Isaacs, and other leaders on Moten's football field. And it was there that they began planning and preparing for a strike in the spring the following year. And they strategized month after month after month on how exactly to raise attention to the deplorable resources and lack of parity between the county's white and Black schools. And on that fateful day of April 23rd, 1951, nearly 70 years this year ago, 450 of the high school's 477 enrolled students. It's hard to think you can get a majority together on anything, but you have an overwhelming, beyond majority number of students who marched to the county courthouse demanding equitable schools. Now, the story goes that there was an anonymous call made to the principal, M. Boyd Jones, notifying him that there were 2 students who were about to get in trouble with the police at the local Greyhound station.
Dwana.
Yes.
I'm going to stop you just because the slideshow isn't showing, and I know folks will want to see that.
Okay. Is this working?
You'll have to share screen again.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, is that working?
Excellent.
Okay, perfect. Well, sorry that you weren't able to see the images. So Barbara John's pictured in the top right corner, and John Stokes is two of the student leaders for the 1951 strike, pictured in the bottom left. And so the principal was called out on a ruse to go help two students who were in distress or allegedly in distress at the local Greyhound station. The principal rushes out to assist the students. And coincidentally, a memo goes around to the classroom signed BJ, which you might say is a forgery, but in all honesty, Barbara John's initials are the same. And it called the teachers to have an emergency assembly. And after this assembly, Barbara John stands up, shocks the teachers, the students who are aware that this movement is about to take place. They march down to the county courthouse to protest the inadequate resources and to call for better books, better buses, better materials. Now, Barbara Johns sought out the assistance of the state NAACP attorney, Oliver Hill, and Spotswood Robinson, who are pictured in the previous slide, on how best to engage a legal process in bringing together better resources to the county schools. Now, here you can see a newspaper clipping from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, standing room only of the African-American community in Farmville, all behind the students' efforts with the strike and a group of the students who are pictured in front of one of the tar paper shacks prior to the mounting this legal challenge. Now, immediately, the Prince Edward County School Board voted, funded, and erected a new all-Black high school on the outskirts of town. Funny what a lawsuit and the threat of a lawsuit might do. Stocked with improved resources for a larger capacity. However, African-American students and parents continued to seek legal redress. After several meetings with the NAACP attorneys, the students and parents signed on to a legal case culminating in Dorothy E. Davis versus the School Board of Prince Edward County, which became one of the 5 test communities forming the Brown versus Board of Education case. Now, following the Brown ruling, Prince Edward County's white community and town leaders resolved to massively resist school integration for 5 years by closing the public schools altogether. Now, instead, the county leadership created an all-white academy, the Prince Edward Academy, in 1959, designed to be a segregationist school only for whites. Most of the county's Black school children over this 5-year period lost access to their education. The national media kind of converged on Farmville as one of the only places in the nation to have closed schools. The children who emerged, and this is a documentary of which Dr. Moss is featured pretty prominently, Equality Under the Law, The Lost Generation of Prince Edward County. The national media labeled the children who were impacted the lost generation, as they were harshly impacted by the closed public schools. And the school closings tainted the public's memory of the county. In the 1960s, the national media continued to tell the story and broadcast the story of Prince Edward County as one of the only places that President John F. Kennedy noted as 4 places in the world where children were denied the right to attend school: North Korea, North Vietnam, Cambodia, and Prince Edward County. For whites, the idea of resurrecting the memory of Moton only seemed to revive dormant racial animosities by the mid-1990s. As former 1963 Prince Edward County alumna Edith Allen bemoaned, "I do sometimes think that I wish the integration situation in Prince Edward could be laid to rest. You feel like you're beating a dead horse." Yet for African Americans who were members of this lost generation, there was power in remembering the closings. James Gee argued that, like the Jews remember the Holocaust, we shall never forget the price we paid for public education. And the promise of commemorating Moton as a site of importance suggested that African American children's lives and African American education not only was important, but it had value. When the public schools reopened in 1965, the Board of Supervisors reluctantly funded the public schools to the very bare minimum required by the federal mandate. And in fact, it was so low, it was around $89,000. And comparatively, they decided to fund almost twice as much money for tuition grants for the private school academy. So the public school was well underfunded. 1,500 students enrolled in the first year back. There were only 8 students who were white. The public schools employed 78 teachers to teach these 1,500 students. 69 of them were Black and only 9 were white. Now, this is remarkable because this is the first time in the county's history that integration had occurred. Prince Edward County had hired a new superintendent to replace the retiring superintendent, Thomas McWayne. This new superintendent, Bryant Harper, was to serve over this new desegregated school system. Now, Harper's children, like a majority of white citizens in the county, attended Prince Edward Academy. And Harper, as the head of the school system, as the superintendent, had publicly stated to various educational groups the hopeless situation of the county's public schools. He concluded that Black students had no chance in succeeding in the schools. And by the spring of 1968, there was a group of 100 Black parents who formed the Citizens Advisory Committee, which was headed by Reverend Harry Hudson and also later co-headed by the fighting preacher, Reverend L. Francis Griffin. Now, this committee, this advisory committee, charged Harper with, quote, transferring his own pessimism and lack of confidence to the teachers, with the inevitable result that the pupils will do less well than they otherwise could.
Dwana, one more. I'm sorry to do that. Just if you just click on the slides so they'll advance.
Oh, okay. There's no next slide yet.
Okay.
Okay.
So yeah, the last slide it's on is the one with Barbara and John Stone.
Oh, okay.
We'll just have to click on each one individually.
Okay. Let me take it from. Does this work better?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So this Citizens Advisory Committee that gets formed to address the superintendent's sense of pessimism, his defeatist view of the public school system. They also argued that Harper, this new superintendent, failed to hire qualified Black teachers for administrative positions, such as the director of instruction, where he was reported as saying that it was allegedly, quote, not a woman's job. Reverend Harry Hudson argued that the schools cannot move forward with Mr. Harper as superintendent. Mr. Harper has no diplomacy. Now, coincidentally, 4 years later, after Harper is journeying out of Prince Edward County, one of the 2 women who was recommended to Harper to hire, Vera Allen, as to serve as the director of instruction, actually became Prince Edward County's director of instruction. Now, this advisory committee cited the high teacher turnover rates, as many teachers left the school after a year or less. And the white teachers who did decide to stay with the public schools constantly complained and belittled students who lagged so far behind. They wanted the school board, this advisory committee, wanted the school board to hire more Black teachers to whom students could relate, or at least white teachers who could develop a positive rapport with the predominantly Black student body. And in the fall of 1968, Black students at the newer R.R. Moton High also grew frustrated with the lack of responsiveness of the school board to address the lack of a student-teacher rapport. And they also complained of the absence of Black representation in educational policymaking. Now, they decided in 1968, in the fall of 1968, to stage a two-day walkout of the high school. And this is going to be informative for the next year or the same academic year, but in 1969, for efforts of mobilization among the student body. The school board responded by appointing an 8-member predominantly Black advisory committee to present issues of importance at the monthly school board meetings. And these meetings were headed by Reverend Griffin, who was the leader of the local NAACP, had been very vocal in the school desegregation, the efforts to reopen the schools and the school desegregation trials, culminating with this children and Griffin versus the County Board of Education, which reopened the schools in 1964. And so Reverend Griffin served as the official leader of this committee, which gave a greater voice to this grassroots advisory committee. But the tenuous relationship between the advisory committee and the all-white school board and the predominantly Black student body began to reach a fever pitch by April of 1969. Young and popular, and I know this is a bit grainy of an image, it's a photo from a newspaper, so it's not the most ideal, but this guy, T. Burwell Robinson, also known as T.B. Robinson, excited many Black high school students at Moton with his unconventional teaching strategies. Robinson was a recent graduate of Hampton-Sydney College, where during the school closings, he had tutored students. He got hired on as a teacher at the high school, and he began to incorporate Black history and contemporary topics into his classes. T.B. Robinson allowed his students to express their anger, as one student recalled, in talking about current events. He also participated in civil rights protests. He provided extra tutoring services, which contributed to his growing rapport with his students. Robinson also informed students about the possibilities of college. And unlike Superintendent Harper, he seemed to be pouring hope into students rather than despair. So it was surprising to many students that on a Monday in April 14th, 1969, at the monthly school board meeting, school board vice chairman, Dr. Ray Moore Jr., argued that the all-white school board served as a buffer between the county's white segregationists and the private academy and Blacks, that it was the intermediary. And in an 11-page treatise called Toward a More Balanced Viewpoint, Moore argued that the advisory committee wasn't as best a bridge, but in fact, it provoked racial discord within the county by demanding that the board hire based on race. He argued that the public schools seemed to mark a shift in a turn to Black power. And so he supported the disbanding of the advisory committee in favor of a school board controlled appointees, including Black principals of the local public schools. And when Dr. Moore gave this speech and talked about this toward a more balanced viewpoint at this school board meeting, 30 to 40 African Americans who were in attendance walked out before Moore completed reading the report, where highlighting the lack of Black autonomy in educational decisions, Reverend Griffin later told a reporter covering educational news that he would, quote, not consider being on any committee appointed by the school board or any other official body in Prince Edward County, except by the people who suffer the injustices. So this is a growing call for more control over, local control over the schools and the decision-making within the schools. So on Monday, April 14th, Dr. Moore and school board present this policy that there's racial discord being charged up with this advisory committee. They vote to disband the grassroots committee and replace it with a new, they appointed committee, a new committee for which they appointed people. And by the end of the week, on Friday, April 18th, T.B. Robinson's teaching contract was not renewed for the 1969-1970 academic year due to quote unquote incompetency. When students heard that the school board wasn't going to renew Mr. Robinson's contract, they were in an uproar. And it is what Moton High School principal Alfred O. Hosley called the straw that broke the camel's back. Moton students had complained for a long while, which culminated in a two-day walkout in 1968. But since the schools had been open, they had complained that the whole academic program in the public schools had problems. There was a lack of after-school transportation for extracurricular activities. There were limits to the advanced coursework that was available for students. There was next to none Afro-American curricular choices. And there were even limited vocational educational offerings. And even more glaring, poorly funded schools. And it seemed that the public schools and Black students themselves were not valued. Robinson's effectual firing merely lit the powder keg of frustrations that were building within the student body. Students locked themselves in the auditorium at Moton High and refused to attend classes. And by the following Monday, a week after the school board meeting that disbanded the advisory committee for a school board-led committee, half of the high school student body participated in a day-long sit-in demanding Robinson's contract be renewed. They designed placards and flyers and organized a protest march to call attention to the lack of Black representation in school leadership. Now, by that Wednesday, 300 students, composed mostly of Moton High School students and a handful of Hampton-Sydney and Longwood College students, decided to take that 3-mile walk to the county courthouse where they chanted, "Superintendent Harper can't turn us around. We ain't gonna let old Harper turn us around. We're gonna keep right on walking till we get TB back." Students organized direct action strategies, marches, and sit-ins, and they wanted to restore Robinson's job, but they also wanted to call attention to the lack of Black representation in school leadership. Now, for a school system that was over 97% Black, the school board's decision makers and the school board of supervisors' purse string holders were 100% white. Now, these students demanded that the school officials hire veteran Black teachers who had been denied contracts based on their criticism of the school board. They demanded that there would be more Black representation on the school board. And they also demanded that Robinson be granted a due process hearing for his contract for why he was not hired. They also demanded no punishment for the demonstrations. They would not be penalized for protest. Students returned to their classes the following week, and the school board decided, based on these protests from these students, to reinstate the previous advisory committee to serve as the intermediary between themselves and the African American community, the position that it once held prior to that April meeting. However, by Monday, April 28th, at yet another school board meeting, African American students, parents, alumni of Moton continued to voice their frustrations with the county school board. Those were just trinkets. Moton High alumnus Willie Shepherdson, perhaps most vocally, class of Moton High School graduate class of 1955, stood to speak to school board members advocating Black power concepts of community control and an Afrocentric curriculum before a packed crowd of over 800 parents, teachers, and students. According to Shepardson, Robinson's firing was just one of a long line of uneven racial balance of power, including the hiring and firing of teachers, curriculum choices, and resource allocations. Warning school officials that, quote, Blacks were being pushed to the limit. He implored the school board to act quickly to right the racial wrongs done so consistently in the county. Now, by the subsequent school board meeting on May 12, 1969, Black parents initiated further strategies to compel the school board to increase Blacks' policymaking power in school affairs. Now, by yet another school board meeting 2 weeks later, on May 12, 1969, Robinson was still making news in a local paper, grassroots newspaper, The Voice of Prince Edward County, which was run by a large number of Moton High School students, and it served as a counterpoint to the pro-segregationist local newspaper, the Farmville Herald. There was a report, as you can see here in this on this slide, that school officials, including Moton's Black principal, Ernest Penn, had tried to oust him from his elected position as the president of R.R. Moton's PTA. And Robertson argued that he wasn't going to leave because it's not up to the school officials to determine who is the head of the Parent-Teacher Association, but instead it is he was elected by the parents to that position, the parents and teachers to that position. But it was at this May 12th meeting with the backdrop of Robinson, who had been fired, who had not been fully granted a due process hearing, that represented much larger issues within the educational arena in Prince Edward County. African Americans initiated further strategies to compel the school board to increase Blacks' representation in making policy in school affairs. Members of the advisory committee penned a response to that the earlier April Toward a More Balanced Viewpoint that Dr. Moore read, known as the Anonymous Manifesto. And in this report, the advisory committee argued that there needed to be a better recruitment for quality teachers, and that they endorsed a selective buying campaign, an effective boycott, to call the attention of the business community to the school situation. And this boycott was largely effective, along with these high school students' protests. The advisory committee also sought to remove Superintendent Bryant Harper from his position as soon as possible, and to have a majority Black representation on the school board. They called for the enforcement of compulsory attendance laws for both white and Black students, which would compel more white students to attend the public school system, and finally to rehire T.B. Robinson in his position. Well, the school board responded, and they did have, and yet another from a yearbook image, so not the best grainy image, but if you can see in the foreground, Dr. Nathaniel P. Miller, who was a local dentist, and to the right is James Holmes. And there were 3 school board members who had resigned in early June 1969. And the school trustee electoral board quickly appointed 2 African Americans, Dr. Miller and James Holmes, to serve on the school board. Now, Dr. Miller had been involved with school affairs, both remarkable because they were both independent. They had independent ties and employment. Dr. Miller was 76 years old, and Mr. Holmes was 59 years old and was a barber, a local barber. Superintendent Harper resigned as well, along with these other 3 school board members. And as a result of these gains, the advisory committee stopped this economic boycott. Now, those were some gains, modest gains, but the Voice continued to editorialize that there still needed to be more that was done. That Black representation was only as good as their ability to be vocal was. How were these Black representatives on the school board advocating for issues related to the Black students in the public school system? And they found that, unfortunately, Dr. Miller and Mr. Holmes were not as vocal as they would have liked. Moreover, although the school board had appointed these two men to serve as school board officials, they also welcomed another man, Kenneth Whitley, that same year, who had publicly stated, quote, "Until the public school system in Prince Edward County is run in a civilized manner, I will continue to send my children to Prince Edward Academy." Now, that statement might strike you, and I hope that it does, as a bit alarming, especially considering that he is part of this new school board that would be the guiding force to oversee and to ensure that the school system is run in a civilized way and that quality education is provided for all of the school children. Now, by the end of this acrimonious 1968-1969 academic term, African-American students and parents had obtained some of their aims. They had gotten some representation, although the representation may not have been as vocal as they had hoped. But many of the gains did not go far enough to make the systemic changes that they had hoped for. The school board began to codify new policies of student behavior in a newly crafted student handbook for the 1969-1970 academic year, in which school officials threatened to discipline students, whether involved directly or indirectly in the planning or execution of any disruptive demonstration or protest. And they vowed to execute this to the full force of state laws. So really forceful language, really heightening the ability or the inability of students to voice any dissent of what they viewed as inadequate in the public school system. By the summer of 1969, also, the name of R.R. Moten High was voted to be changed to Prince Edward County High School, which is currently the name of the local high school. And this was done in hopes of attracting more white students to the public school system. And it felt as a bit of a betrayal for many of the African-American students within the county. The former R.R. Moten High, for which the museum now stands, became and was the site of the 1951 protest, became Farmville Elementary School. Many of the teachers in the public schools continued to graduate Black students, even if they weren't prepared. Prince Edward County High School alum Warren Brown recounted his speedy educational career. Unable to attend school until he was 10 years old, Brown completed 12 grades in just 7 years. And when I talked with him, he recalled the lack of encouragement by his teachers. He said, "I was angry for a long time at some of my teachers, particularly at the high school, because I had never had any teacher in the school say to me, 'You can make it if you try.'" Teachers often sought to pass Black students to the next grade, and Brown continued, "A lot of times what they would do, if you were close, if they knew you were already behind, they would send you, sort of like social passing. In fact, if I remember correctly, I think I repeated the 7th grade. I failed 1 year on top of everything else, yeah." But he was able to graduate and make up 7 grades within a short period of time. So the memory of this 1969 student protest while very present in student participants' minds, has faded into the background of history. Although contentious, this 1969 Moton High School student protest never witnessed the high drama of closed public schools that the 1951 student strike did. It emerged in the midst of other student-led demonstrations like civil rights, calls for Black power, and anti-war movements. While both student protests involved active and organized students who sought remedy to inadequate schools, the 1951 student strike pushed for access to greater resources, and the 1969 student strike sought more Black control over school decision-making. Now, during the debates over what to do with R.R. Moton High in 1994, African Americans capitalized on the importance of situating the African American experience into both the county's history, but also that of the nation's history. Indeed, local Black preservationists attested that granting National Historic Site status to Moton would legitimate Prince Edward County's Black residents' school desegregation experiences. As Vera Allen, pictured here in the center with her daughters, Edwilda Allen Isaacs and Edna Allen Bledsoe, who recently passed away, argued that saving Moton was the last battle for our legacy. In 1993, when Longwood had obtained ownership of the land on which Moton sits through eminent domain, Longwood debated whether to sell Moton or tear it down for development. And there were grave fears by African Americans that there would be a profound loss of its community's cultural centers like Moton, which mobilized people like Mrs. Allen to work to preserve the building. While most whites viewed the commemoration process of Moton as evoking the school closings era, many African Americans had a different relationship with the place and the space. Most Blacks had attended Moton. They taught there. They staged a protest movement there. And they had built a community at Moton. As a result, Black organizations such as the Martha E. Forrester Council of Women, headed by Vera Allen, fought to obtain ownership over the school. Now, Ms. Allen, who was a former Black teacher, later served as the director of public instruction for the public school system. She had been displaced when the schools closed in 1959, when the schools shut down. Along with Prince Edward County Historical Society President James Gee, a former Black student who was in 8th grade when the schools closed, they both latched on to this idea of converting the old Moton High School into a National Historic Site and/or Civil Rights Museum. For both of them, Moton symbolized the quintessential American story of grit, hard work, and persistence in the face of against all odds. Commemorating Moton would redeem the county for its period of school closings and tie it with other struggles for civil rights. Now, local Farmville Herald editor Kenneth Whitley, pictured here, also took up Moton's cause, and he began to editorialize about the importance of preserving Moton. Now, the Farmville Herald, which had once served as the mouthpiece for the massive resistance movement, now had a decidedly different position through the editorship of Kenneth Whitley. Whitley likened the preservation of Moton to the essence of the Founding Fathers' mission for independence. He argued that we're not talking about a pile of bricks. We're talking about the soul of America. And this national element of Moton's legacy allowed Prince Edward County's whites and Blacks to participate in its remaking, in its refashioning of the narrative of what we know and remember about Prince Edward County. By removing the local closings era from this newly remade image, Moton's commemoration obscured the grave losses that Blacks suffered at the hands of segregationists. Furthermore, Moton's national status also helped reconcile whites and Blacks, and in a town where tensions went unspoken and hurts unhealed. Kenneth Whitley further wrote an editorial where he said that it would, quote, be a healing act of affirmation in Prince Edward County. The Moton Branch School is a rare piece of American history. We can't rewrite history, but we can remake it. And make it was indeed what Black and white county residents did, in inserting their place not only in history, but also in the city's landscape. Black and whites crafted a narrative of racial cooperation and a space for both races, both in the past as well as the future of the town. By centering the 1951 student strike in Moton's narrative, county whites and Blacks are able to find common ground in identifying the strike as a part of a progressive identity. You can see here the panels in the rooms in which we tour Moton Museum, the galleries that you can see that follow the 1951 strike to the reopening of the schools. Moton becomes ground zero for the modern civil rights movement. It is where the first organized student protest movements began. The efforts undertaken by those high school activists in 1951 brought racial reconciliation to not just the county, but to the nation as well. And at the opening of R.R. Moton Museum in 2001, NPR's Juan Williams articulated the role of students' protests at Moton. He said, quote, Prince Edward County school closings have always been about the children. It's always been about what we tell the children about what happened here. And it's always been about the children now grown who are such heroes and have made this sacred ground. This sacred ground helped convince whites and Blacks who found little value in memorializing Moton. In 1996, the Board of Supervisors agreed to sell Moton to the Martha E. Forrester Council of Women. By 1998, the U.S. Secretary of the Interior designated Moton as a National Historic Landmark, the highest level of historic recognition offered by the federal government. And after further grassroots efforts made by the Council of Women, R.R. Moton opened as a museum on the 50th anniversary of the student strike, 20 years ago. The General Assembly expressed its profound regret for the period of school closings in 2003 as well. And they began to provide scholarships for the students who were locked out of the school system between the years of 1959 and 1964. In 2008, Prince Edward County held a Light of Reconciliation ceremony where the primacy of the 1951 strike and its student leadership were honored. On the plaque placed at the county courthouse, it reads, illuminated in the courthouse bell tower on July 21st, 2008, by the Board of Supervisors of Prince Edward County in the honor of Barbara Johns and the students of the Robert Russa Moton High School and all the children of our county for their historic role in ending public school segregation in the United States and with sorrow for closing schools. When we raise our eyes to see this light, may we also incline our hearts and our minds to shine our own light of reconciliation toward all people. It's in the same year, 2008, that these student protesters from the 1951 strike became part of the landscape of the state capitol. On the grounds of the governor's executive mansion, the Virginia Civil Rights Memorial illuminates the impact of the 1951 strike further. And there were other recognitions of student activists and local African-American activists within Farmville. renaming of the street on which Moat Museum resides is named after Reverend Griffin. The town council had formed a Barbara Johns committee to determine how to best honor her, and they decided that in December of 2017, the county would rename the Farmville Prince Edward County Community Library building, now the Barbara Rose Johns Farmville Prince Edward County Community Library. And in 2014, Longwood University apologized for those who have been hurt in the school closings. Longwood and Moton now have formal affiliation and have had formal affiliation since 2015. So a series of books have been written, and I always find it interesting when I talk with people about Prince Edward County, how school children don't know, and I think that's starting to change, much credited to the efforts of those who push to make Moton an important and a dominant part of the story in Farmville. But much has been said of nobody really knows what happened. How can we forget the story of what happened in Farmville? There have been more books that have been published, both as memoirs and as scholarly treatment in the past 20 years. And I ask, what can we then make? And what should we make of the legacy of these two student-led protests, about 18 years apart, in 1951 and in 1969? What can we make of the attempts to preserve the building of R.R. Moton High? Well, I'm reminded of Indigenous author Thomas King, who's written many stories, talking about stories. And from his book, The Truth About Stories, he had a very telling passage that struck me. The stories are wondrous things, and they're dangerous. So you have to be careful with the stories you tell, and you have to watch out for the stories that are told. Now, narratives indeed have a lot of power. The stories of both the protests of 1951 and in 1969 demonstrate how the collective memory of a community can converge with concepts of race and power. The narrative of the 1951 student strike has come to reshape the identity of a rural Southern town from one of massive resistance to a new narrative of massive resilience. It has allowed early African-American advocates for preserving Moton to have their voices and stories emerge as part of a national story about protest and civil rights. However, the 1969 student protest does still continue to remain mostly forgotten. The greater demands for Black autonomy over public education and the subsequent retreat from those educational gains remains an unsatisfying story. The memory of vocal protests by African-American students and parents have not yet yielded a common story arc around which whites and Blacks in Prince Edward County can agree. And it's this story that avoids a neat narrative, but instead, I argue, implies continued need and continued work for equalizing racial parity within the county. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dwana. We appreciate that presentation. I think it is appropriate given that we are commemorating this year the 70th anniversary of the student walkout, as well as the 20th anniversary of the museum opening to the public. And for us here at the museum, it was great to highlight those who labored for our success through the years. I do have a couple of questions that have come through the chat. One individual would love for you to comment on what were the different experiences of students as they experienced the school closings here in Prince Edward County.
So the experiences of different students with school closings has been largely a story in looking at oral histories and in looking at, in some of the oral histories I've done myself, have been stories of loss and despair, that there was a lack of education, obviously, but that it had a trickle-down effect, that it fractured families when students had to move to different locations, and that it was very difficult, as I mentioned in the presentation, Warren Brown, who talked about returning to the schools, being older than the traditional age for students in his age group, but then being rushed through the school process and not really being able to obtain all of the quality education that every child should be granted, particularly in a public school system. There have been, though, I can remember attending maybe about 10 or 12 years ago, a Kittrell Junior College presentation at Moton Museum. And I was struck by some of the panelists who talked about the benefit of the schools closing, that the schools in Farmville had not been adequate and didn't seem to be, or weren't likely going to be particularly adequate. And so the opportunity that that group of students who were able to go to Kittrell College in North Carolina actually had more experiences and a broader set of experiences. So for some of them, while it was negative and harmful and hurtful for the largesse of the African American community, it was beneficial to them individually.
Thank you for that. The second question that comes through just kind of mentions that, you know, one of the great things about the history of Prince Edward County as it relates to civil rights and education is that there are great lessons of student activism, of community activism that are woven through at each turn. So the question is, how do you utilize those lessons? How are those lessons being utilized in today's environment as we see some of the calls for continued progress?
Now, I almost added with my presentation, you know, that hasn't been a groundswell, to my knowledge, in Farmville of students who are kind of taken to the streets in the same way that they did in 1951 and 1969, or at least not yet. But in the state of Virginia, probably most vocally, there was a protest last year before kind of the shutdown with COVID in Charlottesville, and those students have been impacted by the state of affairs that have happened in Charlottesville with the Confederate protests in 2017. And against that backdrop, and what's striking about that protest that made national news, and one of the students, high school students who is an activist and has been very outspoken, there are lots of echoes back to the things that we hear from the 1951 strike, right? I can see that things aren't equal. Barbara Johns noted, this bus is passing me by and I'm on a bus that breaks down all the time, and this bus doesn't seem to have any issues. I can see, as in the 1969 student strike, that there are inequitable resources. I can sense, you know, we're not getting as much money as other, the Prince Edward Academy is getting. We aren't getting the adequate level of resources. We can't even, as they complained, you know, they can't even stay after school to practice in band or choir or engage in any kind of cultural experiences because there was no after school transportation provided by the county. And so the things that these students were protesting in Charlottesville last year were for having a more expansive curriculum. Same kinds of things that in 1969 students were protesting. And so I think one of the lessons, and this is where the stories and how we craft the stories that we tell about the past is so critical, that how we think about the connection between movements, how do we build upon movements that have already happened? What are the legacies and stories we tell around those movements that we leave behind for future generations to learn those very important lessons of organizing tactics and of strategies in terms of what types of things that you want to protest against, to be able to affect change. I really love that passage of Thomas King. You know, stories are wondrous things. They're dangerous, but they have so much value, and they can tell us so much about who we are as people. And it's through this way of understanding the student protest that students are able to have a linkage of identity and are able to make identity in many ways as well. Oh, I can't hear you, on mute. Sorry.
It happens once every virtual event, so.
Well, you saw I couldn't get the slides together, so I'm no place to judge.
The next question that's come through, as we look at the 51 strike, the 69 strike, what happens during the school closings, how can we utilize the lessons of those events in the continued fight for racial equality? What do they remind us as we wage ahead?
Yeah, I think, the lessons we can gain are twofold. On one hand, what is the utility for how communities craft the narratives that they craft, right? So how do we understand the reasons why we choose to center our focus on one particular movement over another particular movement? And so that tells us a lot about who we see and how we see ourselves as individuals, and even more importantly, collectively, as a collective, as a community. But even in that narrative, even in that story of how that memory gets made, and often, as history moves, memory gets made and gets remade and then gets made again and gets revised. That can tell us, that can be very instructive for us on the ground who are wanting to push for change, so that we can ensure that the actions that we do and how people are going to remember those actions can be sure to leave something behind for people in future generations to cleave to, and to be able to have change in a meaningful way, and in a more meaningful way. So I mentioned the student protests in Charlottesville. That things still remain the same, that we can still see echoes of some of the same issues from 70 years ago when this 1951 strike happened, that there's still some of the exact same issues. Isn't always that I didn't learn from previous generation, but in how we craft that story we're telling, that helps us be able to have that push we need in order to ensure that social justice is able to be met by all people, so that everyone, and particularly when we talk about public education, right, that every child has a fair and equitable and quality education, and that there shouldn't be winners or losers in a school process. You're on mute again, I'm sorry.
There we go. Just checking the chat box if anyone has any final questions for Dr. Dwa, we'd be happy to take those. But again, Dr. Dwa, we are so grateful for you joining us tonight for this Moss lecture. We're grateful that you were patient as we navigated the technical issues at the beginning, but just thank you for what you have shared. Many of the comments in the chat box are just reflective in terms of memories that folks have shared, and just many hand claps of thanks to you, our presenter this evening. And so, we've got someone, just referenced the labor of prior boards, prior staff members in the development of the Moton Museum. And so we are just so grateful. And I just want to thank our collaborators for tonight's Moss lecture, the Department of History, Political Science, and Philosophy, the Longwood University Greenwood Library, the Longwood University Office of Academic Affairs. So thank you. And I see no more questions. And so we will.
I think I saw Gregory John Kelly had a couple of questions that I don't want to lose. So certainly I didn't, time sensitive with a presentation, but I certainly don't mean to besmirch or leave out Lacey Ward and his efforts, monumental efforts with Moton Museum as well, in helping to develop the kind of what you see now of Moton Museum, and to see that transformation. Some of the images I showed with the cracked chalkboard, I can remember walking into Moton Museum. It looked very much like a school, very much like 1939 building, which now tremendous, it's been so much tremendous progress. And I think the other question that I saw, and please correct me if I'm wrong, something about the Amish, but the Quakers that took students in with the AFSC, the American Friends Service Committee, that did help to, they worked very heavily with the free school and to help over this period to provide an opportunity for students to be housed in other communities in the North and the West, and some right in Virginia. And Jean Fairfax played a large role in helping with placement. And certainly they have a large role in the story, or part of the story of Prince Edward County's school desegregation during the closing period.
Thank you. Thank you for catching that. And as I scroll back, I think we've caught all of the questions that have come through. So with no final questions, just thank you for the insight that you have shared. Thank you to our sponsors, to our financial contributors that helped to make tonight's lecture possible. Be on the lookout with our friends at the Longwood Greenwood Library, the Department of History, Political Science, and Philosophy, and the Moton Museum as we continue to provide additional public programming. So thank you all, and have a great day.
Thank you.